Tarun Chabra ji. He is a very great addition to the conference. He has been working among the Todas. Uh, he is going to share the environmentalist activities in the Toda region. This is a tribe in the Nilgiris, in the Uti area, most studied by anthropologists, this community. Uh, but the environmentalist activities, particularly from an Indic perspective, have not been covered by those anthropological reports. Mostly they cover the polyandry or other cultural features of the community. But Tarun Chabraji is going to speak about environmentalist activities in the region. Tarun Chabraji, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm a dentist by profession who's been working with the Todas for almost 3 decades now. And I would like to speak to you about how these indigenous Toda people, the indigenous people of the Nilgiri Hills of South India, have treated their environment as a sacred, worshipped entity for thousands of years. In a traditional Toda mind, when he looks at his physical environment, he doesn't treat it as a series of natural sites, but he looks at a hill as a abode of a deity whose sacred name he would have chanted in the prayers. Similarly, when he looks at a rock or a rock formation, a water body or a pool, he looks at them as divine manifestations of his sacred world. The Toda relationship with his environment and nature, quite expectedly, begins right from birth, when the neonate is a silent spectator to the elaborate ceremonies performed by his or her mother that entail the use of a number of plant species to be used. At the culmination of these birth ceremonies, somebody cuts an umbrella of the Nilgiri holly and holds it over the mother and the newborn child who's inside a cloak, and they go back in procession to their dwelling places. This is to protect them from the evil influence of a star. So a number of plants are used right from the birth ceremonies. The relationship with nature begins. And from the time of the birth ceremonies up till the naming ceremony that takes place after 2 months, the child's face is never kept uncovered outdoors. And when this naming ceremony takes place, just at the crack of dawn, a proud grandfather uncovers the child's face and announces his name, and also points out the rising sun, as you can see here, the temple lamp inside the temple. He also points out the sacred birds, the buffaloes, the temples, the water bodies, all the elements of nature are pointed out to the child on the day of the naming ceremony. And how do these people get their names? They get their names from the sacred prayer words of the sacred landmarks in the vicinity. For example, the grandfather who's uncovering the child's face here, his father was known as Moji, after a sacred pool in the vicinity known as Moji Care. So this is how the Toda people get their names and their relationship with nature. Now, in ancient times, there were 3 major connections with nature. In the most ancient times, the gods and goddesses who were living amongst the Todas, they decided to take residence in certain 34 peaks. And from the time that they took residence in these 34 peaks, the Todas have always believed them to be the abodes of these deities. So even today, some of these deity hills, the Toda elders will not even point their finger. It's sacrilege to even point your finger to indicate the location of these deity hills. They're so sacred. So this is one of these hills. It's known as the abode of God Quatain in Toda. But the Kurumbas who live in the foothills in Attapadi, they believe it to be Lord Shiva's abode. So once a year, during Mahashivratri, the Kurumbas organize a pilgrimage, taking the odd Toda along with them up to this pinnacled peak on Mahashivratri. And this Maleshwar Mala, as it's known in Kerala, is a very well-known peak. And they light a fire on top of that. So these are common deity hills between different indigenous groups. And this is the same Maleshwar Mala or Quatain Hill in the Attapadi area, which is just on the southwestern slopes of the Nilgiris, actually. So this is a deity hill of the Todas. Like this, there are 34 hills, which are deity hills. There's another deity hill known as Dekheni. And there are also scores of other hills, which are lesser sacred hills, which means they're not sacred to all the 15 Toda clans, but to very sacred to one of the clans or 2 of the clans. So there are scores of other sacred hills. So there are a number of hills like that, which are very sacred. This is another deity hill of the Todas. You can see the twin peak where the sun is setting so spectacularly. This is known as Kashgol Hill in Toda, but it's better known by the British name as Nilgiri Peak. And this deity hill of the Todas, Kashgol, is believed to be one of the places where the monsoon sets in. Within a few weeks, the monsoon is going to set in. And the Todas believe that the first mist of the monsoon, they perambulate around this twin peak, like you perambulate around a sacred shrine. And after they perambulate around the shrine, they go to another deity hill, which is known as Conte, in another part of the Nilgiris. And the sacred mist of the monsoon perambulate around this sacred hill, which is known as Conte and Toda, another deity hill. And the Toda belief and the observation, in fact, is that right through the 3 to 4 months of the monsoon, the mists never escape or rise above these hills, which means that they're always covered and shrouded by these mists. And even today, when the Todas suddenly see one of these two hills exposed, they understand that there's some global climate change and they comment about it. So these is the ancient the first connection with nature of the Todas began with when their gods and goddesses took abode in the sacred hills. The second major connection began when the preeminent goddess Teikiji allotted them into 15 clans, and each clan was allotted sacred sites, which constitute the prayers of each of the 15 clans. So these are the sacred sites, which may be the sacred slopes, the pools, the swamps, the wetlands, the trees, the leaves, etc. And when these are enumerated along with the hills, you have several thousand physical features which are sacred, which means they are sacred and that's where they are protected and conserved. So this is the second major connection with nature that began in ancient times of the Toda people with their sacred environment. For example, these rocks that you see here around the Toda hamlet have sacred prayer words. And I'll also tell you that this hamlet that you see here, just aside, many years back, we were searching for the lost orchid of the Nilgiris. It was known as Liparis biloba. And it was such a rare orchid, nobody had seen it for a long, long time. It was supposed to be a lost orchid, that's what it was called. And when we finally found this orchid, we found it at this Toda hamlet. So some of them are so pristine and preserved. So these are rocks that are protected. I'll be talking more about that. The third major connection with nature of the Toda people began when goddess Teikiji's father, En, decided to set up an afterworld for his spirits to reside in. So he told his daughter Teikiji, you look after this world, I'll set up the afterworld Amanod. So the story goes that he went and he said bye to everybody, and he took a long and arduous route, and he crossed about 15 landmarks, and then he set up the afterworld. And from where he ordained that all my people henceforth who have completed all the rites of passage, that means inter alia, using all the different species of plants to be used for the rite of passage, their spirits after their funeral time will take the same journey, crossing the same 15 landmarks to the afterworld. And lo and behold, the afterworld is still located in the Toda area. It's not located in another world above. You can physically still see it. And what's amazing when we started studying the story was that all the 15 landmarks that a departing spirit is supposed to cross en route to the afterworld, all these mythical landmarks can be seen as actual physical sites en route. For example, the place where the spirit is supposed to ascend stone steps, you can see here, actually, there are actual natural stone steps in the middle of a rock where he or she is supposed to ascend the stone steps. So all these mythical sites can be seen as physical sites on the route to the afterworld, like these stone steps you see here. The Todas never knew how to cut rock, the natural formation. And you can see the Toda man going up the rock. I'll give you one more example of these 15 landmarks. When the departing spirit comes to the midway point between this world and the afterworld, he comes to this rock known as Kossar. It's a large rock of charnokite that you see here. And in the center of this rock, you can see a band, like a tennis court band, like running right across the center of this band. And at this point, the departing spirit performs a ritual that was performed at his or her funeral, and with a relative who has come from the afterworld to receive that affinal cloth. He hands over the affinal cloth to the relative who has come from the afterworld, and then he crosses this natural band and begins the second half of the journey. So like that, all the sites can be seen on the field. And this established the third relationship with the environment for the Todas, because the god En said that if you follow all your ceremonies of rites of passage from birth to death ceremonies, using all the 100 species of plants that are required, then your spirits will journey to the afterworld where they will live peacefully. There's no heaven or sin or hell or anything like that for the Toda people. So this is the third major relationship with nature that binds them to nature. When a Toda person, looks at his physical environment, he doesn't register it as a series of natural sites. When he looks at a hill, he sees it as a abode of a deity whose name he would have often chanted in the prayers. When he looks at a rock or a rock formation, a pool or a body of water, he looks at them as divine manifestations of his sacred world. That's how he looks at nature. So this is the hill from where the god En rules the afterworld. It's known as Temushkul. Just remember this hill because I'll be talking about a plant that we recently named. We found a rare species of a new species of plant and we named it after this hill. We found it here. So this is the hill known as Temushkul. And the water bodies also. Just like the hills, the major rivers of the Nilgiris, the Mukurti Paikara and the Avalanche, what the Todas call the Kolikeen and the Kinatili, are deities, just like the hills, and they're treated as gods and goddesses. And before these two rivers were dammed, they were separate crossing points for the lay people and separate for the priests, and always to be crossed on a premise of purity. This is a sacred crossing point on the Avalanche River, known as Tebajiva. And this is a sacred crossing point on the Paikara River. And they were always to be crossed on a point of purity. Now, although the Toda religion and their culture and everything is completely pagan and different, there are some overlapping. For example, these crossing points of these sacred rivers with so many rules and regulations. Now, when we go on a pilgrimage in India, we still call it a Tirth Yatra. But not everybody may know that a Tirth Yatra initially meant a crossing of a sacred river in ancient India. And then it became a crossing, a physical crossing became a spiritual crossing. So we have these overlapping factors between pagan religions like Todas and the Vedic times from the time they've been here in the Nilgiris for thousands of years. And then see here, after damming, this looks like a pretty picture, but the wetlands have been inundated. The river has been dammed. So it is actually against the ecosystem. Again, we have locally sacred waters. Now, just imagine every small Toda hamlet of just 20 to 30 people has several streams. For example, there will be a stream from where a person who is going to become a dairyman priest undergoes elaborate ordination ceremonies using myriad species of thorny plants that you see him using here. He has to collect all these thorny plants and do these rituals for several days, and then he becomes a dairyman priest. And then once he becomes a dairyman priest, there's a separate stream from which only he can draw water for his cooking and dairying processes. For the salt ceremonies I'll be showing you, there is a separate stream. For guests to bathe and to cook, there are separate streams. Imagine every little, and there's a domestic stream, of course. So every little Toda hamlet of some sanctity has a number of water sources. For that, they have to keep their nature protected, right? These are some of the sacred waters of the Todas. Some of them are related to the gods and goddesses. We saw the hill of the god Quatain. This is the pool where he met the goddess Tekiji. So this is how they relate to their water sources, by treating them as sacred, mentioning them in the thing, and also protecting the hydrology preserving species. They know which are the plants that preserve the hydrology, so they preserve those species along the water bodies. The wetlands of the Nilgiris, unfortunately, as you saw earlier, they've been dammed, the rivers, for example, the grass that is used here to match their traditional structures, that is found only in the wetlands of the Western Nilgiris, nowhere else in the world. It's known as Ediochrysis Rangacharai. Now, the Toda relationship with the Shola forests, which are sometimes referred to as living fossils, because they're thought to date back to the time of Gondwana land, tens of millions of years ago. They're referred to as living fossils, can be either sacred or utilitarian. You can see they're bringing up cane to build their temples. This is how a regular Shola grassland looks. And even today, a Toda can tell you that the absence of any climax species found in these areas indicates a degradation in the vitality and health of these climax ecosystems. Now, around every Toda hamlet, as we saw earlier, there are several rocks that are so sacred that they have sacred prayer chant words, and also rituals are performed by the priest, as you can see what he's doing there. These are sacred rocks. There are other rocks that are related to mythological stories. The one that you see on the right, there's another group who came more recently to the Nilgiris, known as the Badagas. They came from the Mysore area. And this story relates to the Badaga couple who went walking a few centuries ago to the Mysore temple in Nanjangud, but they didn't observe the rules of abstinence. So when they came back, the man here, the taller man, wanted to have one last look at the Nanjangud temple, whereas his wife wanted to have the look at her village that she had left for some days now. And because they were a state of impurity, they became petrified and turned to stone. And on the left side, what you see here, around most Toda hamlets, after a process of rethatching the temple, you'll have these huge oval rocks, and these young teenage boys will lift these immense rocks onto their left shoulder as a prowess of strength. So these are sacred rocks. These are sacred prehistoric shrines, which again, the rocks are related to. These are sacred honey gathering sequences, prehistoric rock art around a Toda hamlet, sanctified. Now, like this conical temple that you see here, there are certain Toda temples of such exceptional sanctity that the entire ecosystem, the shola, grassland, the water bodies, wetland, everything is treated as inviolate. And it's because of this that the Todas have been able to protect their ecosystem. And many of these places have their own microclimate, if you see. Now, the Toda buffaloes, just like their masters, are endemic to the Nilgiris. They're not found anywhere else. And presumably because the Todas have been here for so many centuries, and millennia, in fact, the buffaloes that they brought have evolved into a distinct breed of the Asiatic water buffalo, Bobalis bobalis. And the goddess Tekiji separated them into the sacred buffaloes and the secular buffaloes that can be milked for domestic use. The sacred buffaloes are of 6 different grades. Now, the Toda temples are basically dairies of 6 different hierarchical grades from the lowest to the highest. And each of these grades of temple, dairy temples has an associated grade of temple buffalo from which can be milked only by the corresponding grade of dairyman priest. And into this mundane process of dairying, the Todas have incorporated a mind-boggling array of rituals which you can read my book, The Toda Landscape, and you'll understand how much of this buffalo cult ritualization that they've done over the millennia, the Toda people. So these buffaloes are very important because their cultural sustenance and their economy revolves around their distinct breed of this buffalo. It's found nowhere else in the world. Now, the Todas are one of the very rare vegetarian indigenous people in the world, and they're also non-martial people, non-hunting. So their relationship with their fauna should be quite different and unique. For example, even today, if a resident tiger attacks the sacred buffaloes around a temple, the Toda clansmen will haul up the priest and say, you have done some transgression of the dairy temple rules. And that is why the protector, that is the tiger, has become the aggressor. So they introspect. That's how they relate to their fauna, since they're vegetarian and they're non-martial. And the Toda relationship with their animals and birds is such that if a male and female of a certain species looks different, they'll have a different name for them. For example, the pied bush cat, the male and female look different. This is the female that you see here on the screen. And this is known as kupeji. And the male is black and white. It's known as karpils. And this is treated as one of the most intelligent birds by the Toda people. And even today, the Todas believe that if there is a dairyman priest, he's getting tired of doing his rituals in a remote place, he takes a shortcut. The belief is that when he goes to the water body to fetch water, if this bird flutters in his pathway, he'll remember the bedtime stories related to him by his grandmother, and he will retreat and not do the transgression. So this is how they relate to their fauna. This is the Nilgiri Thar. Their relationship with flora is far more intimate. The Todas have used the flowering cycles of plants not only to indicate the different seasons of the year, but also the different stages of seasons of the year. And like we mentioned, all the lifetime ceremonies, we already saw the birth ceremony. This is the pregnancy ceremony taking place in the 7th month of pregnancy in the pitch darkness of the new moon night. So a number of plant species, about 8 plant species are used in this ritual. And here what you see in your screen is these sticks of rhododendron. Only rhododendron has to be collected. And this represents a Kurumba couple, another tribe which is found on the slopes of the Nilgiris, who have been feared by the Todas for their sorcery. So she's actually just cooked some food and she's calling out to the Kurumba couple to appease their spirits. So this is a pregnancy ceremony. Again, pregnancy ceremony. This special bamboo reed has been collected. Water has been collected from a different source and poured from one bamboo to another. And this sanctified water, since it's been poured over the calf, is given to the pregnant lady to drink. So these are pregnancy rites. So all these plants have to be present in the pitch darkness. They have to go and collect 8 species of plants. That means they have to have all these around each and every Toda hamlet. And then you have the paternity rites that when the man, the groom who's saying that I will be the protector of the child to be born in 2 months' time, a number of plant species are used. What you see here is that he has gone into the forest, collected Saphora glauca only, and fashioned an imitation bow and arrow and given it to his wife. And each one of the 15 clans of the Todas has a specific prayer word for this bow and arrow, which is given to them. So these are the paternity rites. Again, specified plant produce. Again, and there are certain kinds of flora which are to be used only not for mundane purposes, but only for sacred processes. Like this girl is doing a ritual here. Now, the Todas are recognized as architects par excellence among the first societies of the world. All over the world, they've been recognized. And their barrel water structures are said to have been inspired by the miniature rainbows that you see here. Tiny little rainbows. You can see here the barrel water structures. Only specific species of bamboos, cane, thatch, and tree poles are used. Not a single nail is used here. And the Todas have recognized the property. They have understood which bamboo has the best tensile strength, which thatch grass has the best properties, etc. and not a single nail is used. These structures can last for half a century, only requiring periodic rethatching. The second kind of Toda architectural structure, the conical temples. And you can see here, the marbles of ancient construction can last for 70, 80 years, only requiring periodic rethatching. And you can see not a single nail is used here. And, most of us have read and heard that the South Indian temples, Vimana or Gopuram, has been inspired from the North Indian temples. But there has been a hypothesis where people have quoted the Toda conical temples as being the local inspiration for the South Indian temples, Vimana or Gopuram. Like I said, the Todas have used the flowering cycles of plants, not only to denote the seasons of the year, but also the different stages of the seasons of the year. This plant that you see here in Toda translates as the monsoon season flower, because when it flowers in July, it indicates the peak of the southwesterly monsoon. And when this plant flowers, the Nilgiri lily, a very handsome plant, when it flowers by the end of August, the Toda elder knows that the monsoon has entered its last phase. And when this, what you see here, the Nilgiri champak, Micalia nilgirica, starts to mass flower in the sholas, the Toda elder will tell you in September, don't worry, the monsoon is going to end in a few days' time. And lo and behold, it's a very accurate indicator of the impending cessation of the southwesterly monsoon. And they also use as climatic indicators. For example, between the two monsoons, you have a kind of a weather pattern known as kasht. And during this part of between these two monsoons, there's a planetary body visible in the night sky known as kasht. The weather pattern or the climatic pattern is known as kasht. And there is a herb that is mass flowering all over the grasslands, which also has the identical name. So they related the weather patterns to planetary bodies and to plants. As indicators of a person's age and wisdom, we have several species of Strobilanthus, one of which is the Kurunji. And the Todas have, unlike the botanists who have only recognized the 12-year flowering one that you see here, Strobilanthus kuntianus, which flowers once in 12 years and covers the entire hillsides blue, the Todas recognize another one known as Pufcut, which flowers once in 18 years. And once in the past, when the environment was totally untouched, people used to use this to indicate a person's age and wisdom. As indicators of, so the Todas know, if you go into some of the ancient Toda songs, they relate how when certain plants are flowering, what will be the pollinators that will visit them, and what will be the honey and the fruits that will emerge after that. And incidentally, this is the carpenter bee that you see here. And many, many years ago, my Toda friend, Kotad Kutan, who Michelle knows well, this friend told me about how this carpenter bee uses another insect to seal up its hives. And he also spoke about other insects, how they use other insects to do their work for them. And I just laughed it off and said, this is just some myth from the tribal people, even though I was so close to the Todas, I just laughed it off. But many years later, I read this paper by Edward O. Wilson, the person one of the people who coined the term biodiversity, Edward O. Wilson, and where he wrote about a paper on slavery in ants. And then when I read this on slavery in ants, I realized that the traditional ecological knowledge of people like the Todas, when they talk about slavery in insects, they've known this for thousands of years earlier. Now, as inspiration for ideas, now you can see the Toda dairyman priest holding the cane milk churning stick here. According to the Toda legend, this cane milk churning stick, which is used in the temples and in the houses, has been modeled or inspired by the flowers of a plant known as kafal or Seriopegia pusilla. And you see here on the left, lo and behold, this plant's flower looks just like a miniature plant milk churning stick. So as inspiration for ideas, as indicators of time, I have this flowering in my house planted. This is the 6 o'clock flower, so called because it flowers at 6:15 every evening, irrespective of weather condition. There's also a 5 o'clock flower, so indicators of the time. As indicators of human reaction. Now, this gentian pedicellata grows in the grasslands. And the Toda name of this plant is Arkilpoof, which translates as the worry flower. Why is it called the worry flower? Because if you pluck this plant and hold it by the stem, if you're worried, the petals will close. And it's so accurate. I've been experimenting for over 20, 25 years with this thing. If you're slightly worried, it'll take a few minutes to close the petals. You're holding it by the stem. If you're very anxious, it'll close in a flash. And if you happen to be one of those carefree types, don't close it all. It's very, very accurate. As indicators of sacred temple species, after dairy temple has been rebuilt by lay Todas, the priest has to take the sacred dairy implements inside. And he purifies this temple using a bark of a tree known as Menosmia simplicifolia. And this bark, which he uses to purify the temple, can only be handled by a Toda dairyman priest. A lay Toda is not supposed to touch the bark of this. So these are sacred species given sanctity, and that's how they've been protected. Because basically, what is essential and sacred is going to be protected. Again, we saw about the priestly ordination at the water body and the thorny plants. Again, priestly ordination, many of these plant species which are used in priestly ordination are not to be used for mundane purposes. As mass flowering indicates what kind of honey will result and what kind of wild fruits will result. As indicators of utilitarian properties, you can see the Toda man drinking from special leaf cups. You're only supposed to drink ceremonial buttermilk and butter from these ceremonial leaf cups, and making fire. Incidentally, this is a wood of a tree known as Litsia whiteana. And even today, whether it's lighting the lamp in the temple or the funeral pyre, fire has to be made by friction only by twirling the sticks of Litsia whiteana. Fire can never be made for any Toda ritual in any other manner. So utilitarian properties. Endemic properties, these two balsams, which are found in the Nilgiris, believe it or not, have their closest relative in distant Africa, thus letting credence to the Gondwana land origin theory. Endemic plant species, this is these are found nowhere else in the world. This is a orchid known as Disperus nilgirans, and these are very rare balsams found only in few valleys of the Nilgiris and nowhere else, known as Impatient nilgirica and Impatient densinae. This took us 4 years to relocate the species. And new species, now many years ago, just to give you an example of the Toda traditional ecological knowledge, we only have this crimson or red rhododendron in certain parts of the Western Ghats, the highest reaches. And the Toda friend, Kotad Kutan, would tell me, we have this white one. So I said, oh, come on, there's no white one. It's never been documented in South India, only in the Himalayas. Until I actually came across these white rhododendron, and that was the first official record of this. So we have to believe that Toda traditional ecological knowledge. Now, this is a new balsam species that we discovered and described quite recently. And I was very happy to name it as Impatience Temushkulnai, after the peak you saw earlier, the peak from where the god En rules the afterworld. If it was found on the slopes of that, so called Impatient Temushkulnai. Now, how the Todas manage the ecosystem? Direct methods. Now, until a few decades ago, to herald the onset of winter, the Toda priest would use the same fire sticks by friction and ceremonially set fire to the grassland at the base of certain deity hills. And this was not only a ritual, but it also served a very useful system of ecosystem management, since these grasslands need to be burned. Now this has been proscribed or stopped by the forest department, and the ecology is in disarray because we don't listen to our own indigenous knowledge. But when the same use of firing of the grasslands is now coming, the reports are coming from Yellowstone National Park in America. Now our people are waking up and saying, oh, why don't we start firing the grassland? But we don't want to listen to our own indigenous knowledge. So the Todas continue to observe indirect methods of ecosystem management. This is how the Todas pray. See how the Toda priest is praying by one hand like this and holding the left hand on his elbow. They pray. They pray by different ways. Sorry. One of the ways the Todas pray is that they, during the different 4 seasons of the year, they conduct the salt pouring ceremonies, as you see here, for the sacred buffalo herds. It's a very sacred ritual. It also provides free, salt to the buffaloes. But a failure to perform this, for example, a failure to perform the salt ceremony for the sacred buffaloes at this part of the year is deemed to be an invitation in the traditional Toda mind for ecological disaster, which means if you don't perform this now, the Todas will believe that the impending monsoon will fail. The monsoon, there'll be less pasture for the buffaloes, there'll be less milk, there'll be less fruit and everything else. The whole ecology will get disturbed. So these are the ways that they still pray and do they keep their ecosystem flourishing. The indirect methods. Another indirect method is they go to the deity hills of Contre. We saw where the monsoon sets in. The priest and the people go up once a year to this Contre deity hill, and they pray for ecosystem and ecological well-being, and also general well-being. So these are the ways, indirect methods, by how they still manage their ecosystem even today. Now, the Todas, like I mentioned, are one of the very few indigenous people in the whole world who have remained generally vegetarian out of choice. As you know, most indigenous people are non-vegetarian. So it brings up a completely different focus to their and their outlook. So this is some of their festive food, grains cooked in milk with honey and served with ghee there. The Toda embroidery is also a very unique art, and our NGO that we applied for the geographical indication or GI patent for this ancient art form from the government of India, and we got it. And most of these traditional embroidery motifs are inspired by nature. This is the honeycomb pattern. Similarly, you have motifs inspired by butterflies, by plants, and by hills and valleys, and etc. So the Toda ecological footprint is very minimal. it's very minimal, their ecological footprint. And their traditional structures that we spoke, the barrel vaulted and these, they act as natural windbreakers. They sequester the carbon. So the ecological footprint is very thin. And the Todas, they're also oral poets par excellence. What you see here, now when we have a Toda festival, there will be one man who will be a master composer, who will be composing impromptu in couplets. And as he composes in couplets, which rhyme with one another, he makes sure that the words, because there are 3 footwork movements in the dance that they do, each word will be in 3 syllabic units to allow the 3 footwork movements, which means if the word is naturally of 2 syllables, he'll put a vowel to stretch it into 3 syllables. And if it's of 4 syllables, he'll condense it into 3. So this, although it's a different way, so every Toda song is composed impromptu, and it's a form of oral poetry. And it's been described as a combination of Homeric and Vedic poetry. And in Vedic time also you have these kind of trimetering and things like that. So there's a lot of overlap between these systems and the Vedic systems and all that. So I think with that, I've come to the end of my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Wow, Tarun, that was just fantastic. It's just mind blowing. I mean, you seem to have spent like what, 30 years on this now, researching?
30 years, yeah.
Wow. This has become part of your life.
Yes.
Can you just share with us how did this happen? And how did this happen and stay with you for so long? Personally, what kind of a personal motivations did you have? What's transformation it had on you? Because this is just one lifetime's effort that we are seeing. And it's just fascinating.
Thank you. Basically, I think that, when I was out of college in my mid-30s, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. When I was out of college, I was in my mid-20s, sorry. I went to this library looking for some profound books on Indian philosophy. And then I saw this book, 2 volumes of this book called The Todas by W.H.R. Rivers, who had come about over 100 years earlier and spent 5 months in the Nilgiris and brought out this magnum opus of his called The Todas. And I said, what can there be on the Todas? I mean, I've grown up here. And I was ignorant like most other Nilgiri people. And I took those books home. And every day as a young person, I would come back from my clinic doing dentistry and wanting to read these rituals and find out what's remaining. Even then, it was 90 years since Rivers had come, even those days. And very soon I started going out with them. And then I realized that I wanted to do something. The culture was collapsing. And I realized that I didn't need a PhD. And, I didn't, want to become a professor or anything. So I wanted to do something for this culture to survive. So we started this Toda Nalvalva Sangam in 1992, and it still functions. And we started doing projects to try and revive their culture. And I'm still the only non-Toda member of this organization. And the last, like I said, we applied and got the geographical indication patent for their embroidery. And, we have many kinds of activities for them. And then I've written many, articles, 70, 80 papers all over conferencing. And then my book came out in 2015. It's called the Toda Landscape. And it's published under the Harvard Oriental Series, volume 79. People who are interested can read that. It's also, the Indian publisher is Orient Black Swan in Hyderabad. And fortunately, that has reached all over the world. But I have not studied dentistry or botany or ecology. I run another NGO called the Etzkuli Not Botanical Refuge, and we're doing botanical studies, like I mentioned, but we're also doing ecological restoration, where we are trying to revive these degraded Shola grassland landscapes using traditional ecological knowledge of the Todas. So this is on the side, yeah.
A couple of comments that I saw, and I was also wondering, because like I mentioned to you, we have some activity there, and just wondering how did the missionaries not get to them, and how did this culture still is alive today? What's been your experience about the conversions, and how did they survive?
See, the Nilgiris has just, we have just commemorated, so to speak, the bicentennial of the British moving in here. 1820, they came in here, the British. They entered the Nilgiris and they found the climate to be such. So they, from Coimbatore, they shifted the part residence here to the Nilgiris, and from 1820. And in fact, there's a book which is coming out to commemorate that. I've also written an article, chapter for that book, which is under press. And I must tell you that from day one, the missionaries went full speed to convert the Todas. And there was this Father Metz in the 1850s who spent almost half a lifetime trying to do that. And at the end, in his memoirs, he says, in those days, in the 1850s, he says it's easier to go to the North Pole or South Pole, I forget, than to reach the soul of a Toda, which means he kind of gave up. But then the missionaries never really gave up. In the early 1900s, there was a Catherine Ling, a missionary who came, and she was working in Tamil Nadu, so she knew, she had, Tamil and other things. And she came and she finally managed to convert these people. So now we have the Orthodox Todas who are about 1,450 people, and we have a small community of about less than 300 Christian Todas who are there. So, but they were not fully, I mean, even Catherine Ling, although she was partially successful, it was not fully successful, fortunately. So that's how the picture stands. And Catherine Ling was she actually worked so hard that she's supposed to have learned the Toda language. Now, I may be the only outsider who speaks Toda today. So if a Westerner like Catherine Ling learned, Toda 100 years ago, can you imagine the effort that she put in there? So that's kind of effort. But yeah, so we have a community of Christian Todas, so very progressive. I mean, there were graduates and other people in the 1950s among the Christian Todas, whereas now only the Orthodox people are studying. And, when I started my work, very few Todas would come to me and to our office and say, my child or my grandchild wants to study in school, college, can you help? It was mostly related to culture or health, other things. But now every second week, somebody's coming, my daughter, granddaughter wants to study. So, I've passed the hat around and my friends are supporting so many people to become the first lawyer, the first few nurses, engineers amongst the Toda people. And, I just pass the hat around. They say, oh, we'll sponsor one person. It's our pleasure. We'll do this like that. So the Orthodox people are finally starting to study. But the Christian Todas were actually quite adept and going into studies even in the 1950s, 60s. So that way they're quite progressive. But they've lost their culture, because a small community like that, you're not going to get a partner from the Toda community. So you're going to marry from outside. So their children who call themselves now as Todas are basically just using the scheduled tribe, symbol to get some benefits. That's it.
What do you think? What do you think are the lessons that we should learn from? One thing is clearly, I mean, that's I'm a big votary of that. Is seeing being devotional to nature, and I think that's a very strong theme that's coming across. But what would you suggest for non-Todas to learn from them?
Before he gets connected, let me share my own experience of studying Todas from a Dravidian linguistic point of view. MNO is the one who worked a lot on the linguistic point of view on the Todas Dravidian linguistics. But one important lesson, as Harikiranji was asking, that most of the cultural anthropologists who worked in this area got was something what Bhutan tells you today. The index of development there is happiness index. The colonial British time cultural anthropologists who visited Toda, Kota is the other tribe which lives just side by side with the same occupation. Mostly these people are dairy people, cattle rearing people. And when they worked on these people, every time they returned with the impression that there is no way you can corrupt these people with the modern ideas of development, modern ideas of progress. Their happiness index was very big. And this is the message we give you, the modern world. That's what the colonial cultural anthropologists were taking back from the Todas. So, Tarunji, you are back on.
Yeah, I'm back. I'm back now. I don't know whether, I'm sorry, I think my internet connection was severed.
Yeah, the question from Harikiranji was, what is the message from Todas to the contemporary world, the other world?
Message to?
The world, the non-Toda world.
Yeah, the message is, that the Todas, the value system is such that they treat their environment, as a worshipped entity, as a sacred worshipped entity. It's nothing like a sacred grove here or there. Their entire environment is a sacred worshipped entity, and they have multitudinous ways in which they relate to that in their day-to-day lives. For example, a person, it happens, it's factored into him every day, because into his hamlet, there may be a flat rock on his pathway, which he remembers that the god Quate had done some ritual there thousands of years ago. So he doesn't step on those rocks. He goes over those rocks, goes to his house. He realizes that there's a pathway which only the priest must use, so he must not use that pathway. So at every part, when he sees a sacred mountain, he has to salute that. So at every stage in life, every day, a Toda person is bounded by certain rules of his sacred environment. So there are multitudinous ways by which they can relate and treat it as a sacred worshipped entity, the environment.
Thank you.
And without extracting much, and we should remember that the Todas have only 1,400 people. So they learned how to, natural way of keeping in harmony with nature, they learned how to keep their population low. And because they needed hundreds of plants, for their culture and other purposes like that. So I think this is a kind of a lesson for the world. We have to realize that there are water systems, millions of people in the plains below, in the Erode, Coimbatore, and all these districts, and into Kerala, all this water which is going from the sacred waters of the Todas is all going and feeding millions of people on the plains below. If the Todas had not protected their ecosystem, where would this water have come from? Secondly, the very fact when the government of India in 1986 was told to select the first biosphere reserve in whole of India. Imagine you have Himalayan ecosystems, you have the northeastern places, you have so many kind of ecosystems in India. The government selected the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, of which the Toda heartland is the core, as the first biosphere reserve in all of India. And I think it is a fine tribute to these people and the biocultural values that they espouse, which I call, that they preserve this area, that their homeland was selected to be the first biosphere reserve in all of India in 1986. Thank you.
Is their work recognized world over, the Toda's work? Because there is now a new concept. Even United Nations, they're talking about every day should be an indigenous day. We should learn a lot from indigenous nations, indigenous environmentalism. Has this example of Toda is known across the world thanks to your work, thanks to your books? How is it? Is it recognized?
I think just the fact, that I'm just an ordinary dentist. I might have, written and spoken like I'm speaking today. But the very fact that the Harvard University Press, a professor from the Harvard University approached me and said, the Harvard Oriental series published from 1891, and my book is volume 79. The very fact that the professor from there approached me and said, Tarun, when your book is ready, we'll publish it under the Harvard Oriental series, because he already knew about the Todas. He was sitting there, not because of anything else. He knew about the Todas, and perhaps he knew about my work. And he trusted me and said, okay, when your manuscript is ready, send it across to me. We'll publish it. So that itself shows that even before I wrote this thing.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tarun Toda Chabra ji.
Thank you.
Thank you for
inviting me. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.